Episode 9. The End of Coal. Welcome back to Tramping's Return to My Trees podcast. This is the final episode of the first series, and today we'll be walking from the top of the Bwlch Mountain all the way over to the town of Maesteg, and we'll be following an ancient Celtic walking path that nowadays also encounters a great deal of wind farms. It's a barren walk, but it's also a really important walk because we'll be looking and discovering how the coal industry, which dominated this part of South Wales, came to fail, and the repercussions of a dying fossil fuel industry on the local people who lived here. I've followed the mountain track all the way along the high ridge that climbs out of Tom Pentre, and I've reached now basically the curve in the road that signals what I've basically made to the top of the Bwlch Mountain. The views from here are absolutely stunning. I can see below me the elaborate hairpin bends in the road leading over the mountain, and at the bottom of the valley the site of the former park colliery at Cwm Park. Behind it, in the distance, I can just make out the top of Pen y Fan, the tallest mountain in South Wales. But if I look directly below, it's pretty clear not everyone respects the beauty surrounding them. Some of the slopes are littered with discarded beer cans, there's soft drink bottles, there's crisp packets, where people have come to have a little bit of a party and they just left their rubbish, as they do. Now, back in 2020, when I was first here, there was even a rusting car stuck down in the valley. Teenagers would run down there, pick their way down there to take selfies next to it. Turns out it had been stolen from a local village and dumped down there. It took over 2 years before the police were able to haul it out of there. So, while it's a truly beautiful place, though a very barren place, it's also pretty clear to me, based on all this rubbish and the way it's being treated, just how disconnected so much of our society has become from nature. I mean, another example I can see in the distance over the hill is tyre tracks carving up the ground where dirt bikers have just turned this part of the mountainside into their private scrambling zone. Makes it almost impossible to walk. It's completely destructive for biodiversity and nature, and it's a complete eyesore, to be honest. Perhaps the root of that disconnection to nature started a couple of centuries ago with the industrialization of the South Wales valleys. As with so many other parts of the agrarian industrial revolution, Wales's coal boom fundamentally altered people's relationship to the countryside. Just as the Welsh language was undermined by the move from rural areas to the new towns that grew up around the coal mines, so was people's connection to the land. Many of the new town dwellers who came from all over Britain had been forced into urban living after the common land they depended on for subsistence farming and grazing had been awarded to private landowners through acts of enclosure, a legal process that intensified across England and Wales in the late 18th and 19th centuries in the pursuit of more intensive and productive agriculture. They were no longer reliant on growing their own food or tending their own livestock. Their provisions came from the local shops serving the mining communities, and their daily lives were divorced from the rhythms and cycles of nature. Though that's not trying to sugarcoat the many challenges of poor rural living during this time. That said, the immigrants who settled in the South Wales valleys during the coal rush came looking for and expecting a better life than the one they had left behind, whether it had been in rural mid-Wales, the English Midlands, Ireland, or beyond. Huge fortunes were made, but the real wealth was generated and remained in Cardiff, Barry, Newport and Swansea, where the coal was sold and exported. Very little, if any, of that vast wealth flowed back up the valleys to the mining towns I was looking down on now. Perhaps the most sobering thing about the South Wales coal boom was how short it was. More than 57 million tonnes of coal was produced in 1913 by 232,000 men working in 620 mines in a thin corridor of valleys. By 1920, the industry employed 271,000 men across South Wales, but in the following years, demand for Welsh coal began to wane. Top-grade Welsh steam coal now faced new competition from mining operations in Germany and the United States, and from an existential threat, an oil industry that was fast replacing the old steam age. Nearly 250 mines closed across South Wales between 1921 and 1926. That year, a royal commission concluded that the coal industry had to be reshaped and that miners needed to accept lower wages. The private mine owners jumped at the opportunity and demanded large cuts. The miners' union refused, and on April the 30th, workers were locked out. Coalfields in South Wales and across the United Kingdom came to a halt. For 9 days, the UK economy was paralysed as most of the workforce went on strike to support the miners. However, on the 12th of May, other unions returned to work after agreeing terms with the government. The miners carried on until the end of the year, when starvation forced them back to work. Many no longer had a job, however. To stave off mass unemployment, the UK government put some miners to work on large-scale infrastructure projects, including the Bwlch Mountain bypass, part of the larger Glamorgan Inter-Valley Road project, which was completed in 1928, and which I was walking above right now. Before the road was built, the mining towns had no way of accessing neighbouring valleys unless they undertook the type of hike I was on, essentially following ancient paths up and over the mountains that had been walked since probably the Silurian period of the Celts. The Bwlch bypass wasn't just a public works project to ease the unemployed miners' unrest. Politicians in London also thought it could provide communities with a way to access nature and to escape the often dark, dank existence they had at the foot of the valleys. For this reason, the road, with so many switchbacks on it feels like navigating an alpine pass, was built to accommodate both motor vehicles and pedestrians. Over the decades, generation after generation of local sightseers hiked to the top of the mountain. The Bwlch became so popular that one enterprising Italian immigrant family set up an ice cream van in the car park at the summit. Their reputation grew to such an extent that the mountain is now known as Ice Cream Slope by the many hang gliders who head up here to float on the thermals formed as warm air from the coast hits the cold air at the top of the mountain. The other major project that the UK government put Welsh miners to work on after the First World War was planting vast forests of conifer trees. All across Wales, the Forestry Commission set up camps for miners, primarily to rehabilitate and recondition the men so they were ready once again for tough manual labour. Here, in the Ogmore and abutting Avon Valley, major new forest projects were launched. I've moved on from the summit of the Bwlch, and I've been following an ancient path as it leads towards the town of Maesteg. I've made it now to the edge of a sprawling wind farm. I can sort of follow this wind farm nearly all the way to get to my destination. From here, I can see a wide carpet of connected conifer forest. It starts at Coed Bwlch and runs across the horizon to Rheola Forest, where some 13,000 acres of conifers were planted over a 20-year period, and that's near the town of Neath. this monocultured expanse would become known as Coed Morgannwg, Glamorgan Wood. Nowadays, it's better known as Afon Argoed Forest Park. The wind turbines are majestic and mostly quiet despite spinning at considerable speed. Watching this new generation of Rhondda industry, it feels like the energy equation truly has been turned on its head. Once local people dug deep underground for the fuel to power their homes and businesses. Well, today, that energy is being harnessed from the skies above. The wind energy revolution is cleaner and healthier for everyone, though it employs a fraction of the workers who once made a decent living from coal. And there's another issue as well. As I talked about before, the wealth from the coal industry left the valleys. It stayed in parts of the major cities, but a lot of it left Wales as well. And that seems to be happening yet again with the wind revolution. The companies who are setting up here and are harvesting wind energy and making the money off it are not Welsh companies for the most part. And very few in the communities here are seeing any of the revenues or benefits that are coming from this new industry. Coal still employed 140,000 people in 1936, but South Wales had lost 241 mines since the end of the First World War. At the end of the Second World War, the UK government nationalised the coal industry, invested in new machinery and raised safety standards. However, the rise of the oil industry left coal unable to compete financially. More than 50 collieries closed between 1957 and 1967. The South Wales coal industry limped on through the 1970s, even as more pit closures and job losses ate away at the local communities. Then, in 1984, Margaret Thatcher's government decided to push through a wave of new colliery closures that would deprive entire towns and communities of their raison d'etre. In response, the National Union of Mine Workers called a national strike that lasted nearly a year. Striking miners were supported financially by fundraising efforts in the local community. But, as the months went by, and the Thatcher government grew more determined not just to win the strike, but to destroy the National Union of Miners, it became increasingly hard for the mining towns to survive. When the strike collapsed, the South Wales mining industry was finished, its communities shell-shocked and abandoned. I'm now looking down at the town of Maesteg, and further on, the village of Nantyffythlon, and further on, the village of Caerau. All of these communities were devastated when the local mines here were closed down. Today, one of the biggest mines in this area has been reimagined as a park. It's called the Spirit of Llynfi, and it's quite a vast area that is taking over, well, basically where the old mine workings were. It's also one of the designated parts of the new National Forest for Wales, and the idea is to try and build it up and develop it as a woodland that can help local communities that have been so deprived of access to nature reconnect in their own way. For the Thatcher government, the decision to call time on mass coal production in Wales made economic sense, but business expediency can't excuse the brutal and cynical way they treated the people of South Wales. What stung back then was the knowledge that there were still great quantities of coal that could have been produced if the government had wanted to support the industry. Instead, it wanted to break the unions. So an entire industry was shut down without any plan for how the local communities that were completely dependent on coal would survive and rebuild. In the aftermath, the entire South Wales Valleys region descended into a spiral of economic and social depression, the effects of which continue to this day. Unemployment became chronic and crime rates soared, as did substance abuse, alcoholism, and social unrest. 30 years later, when Thatcher died at the age of 87 in 2013, many a pint was raised in the pubs throughout the valleys, accompanied by a toast. Ding dong, the witch is dead. The way the UK government destroyed the South Wales coal industry and the fallout and stagnation that followed should be a cautionary tale as global society plans its post-fossil future. Today, governments all over the world are fast-tracking policies to wean industry and the public off coal and oil, a shift given fresh urgency as politicians start to grasp that the economic devastation brought by the COVID-19 pandemic could just be a minor dress rehearsal for what climate change will bring. We now know that the world must limit global warming to well below 2, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels, if we are to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That means not just the end of all coal production, but ultimately also oil exploration. Effectively, all the coal and most of the oil sitting under the earth has to be considered what economists call stranded assets, natural resources that exist but can never be used. When Welsh coal mining shut down, a generation of people lost their jobs, their pensions and their investments. Today, most people's pensions are invested in some way in the oil industry, and millions of people around the world are directly dependent on fossil fuels. The pandemic might have opened our eyes to the need to transition to a post-fossil fuel economy, but unless we have a very clear roadmap of how to proceed and why it's important to do so, progress will be too slow, many will suffer, and the much-needed energy transition's chances of success will rapidly diminish. At the moment, people around the world feel just as lost, confused and depressed as the people here in South Wales did when their world turned on its head. Collectively, I can't help but feel we are trapped in that liminal state. We are looking for a better way of moving forward, but we still have one foot stuck in the past. Our world needs a new map, one that shows us how to appreciate, value, and navigate our world without destroying it. And we need to find it fast. You've been listening to Return to My Trees, a Tramping podcast. It was narrated by Matthew Yeomans and edited by Bwlch Yeomans. The musical interludes are by the folk duo Filkin's Drift. Join us for the next episode, where we delve even deeper into the woodlands of Wales.